Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please look us up on your favorite podcast app, subscribe, like, and share so that you never miss an episode. If you'd like to further support us, visit patreon.com/speakingout and check out the different rewards. You'll find exclusive rewards if you sign up as a patron of the podcast. Thank you for your support, and let's get into the show. Well, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. We thank our patrons, as always, for making this podcast happen. Today we have with us a special guest, Charis Barker. Charis, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate you inviting me to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. Charis is going to share some of her story, and your story intersects, unfortunately, with Bill Gothard. And we had an episode with Eric Skorzinski not that long ago.
2 months. Maybe.
Yeah, probably a couple months.
Yeah.
And he talked about, he actually read excerpts from some of the manuals. I forget what they're called, but the little booklets that went out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty mortifying. So I'm just going to let you introduce yourself and talk about the Advanced Training Institute and its teachings for people who've never heard of it. And that's what Eric had read from some of the booklets from that. So introduce yourself a little bit and tell us a little bit about ATI and what they teach.
Sure. ATI was kind of the brainchild of Bill Gothard back in the mid 80s. Homeschooling was becoming a thing. And there's all kinds of hypotheses on why he began the homeschool group that he did. But all that aside, my parents joined sometime around 1986 when I began school. They had been a fan of Bill Gothard from the mid 70s. And so they had always followed his teachings as long as I'd been alive. And when they saw that he had a homeschool program, they knew they wanted to home educate their children. And so they, of course, signed right up. It was very strict at the time. You had to turn in a huge application listing how many hours of TV you watched in a week, whether or not your wife worked, whether or not there were all kinds of crazy stuff that was very intrusive.
I assume for listeners who aren't familiar with some of the more conservative circles, like you get docked if your wife works because your wife is supposed to be stay at home. Right. Like she takes care of the under the whole umbrella. You know, there's Correct. God, and then Jesus, and then man/husband, and then wife, and then children, and there's kind of a hierarchy. Correct. Which is crazy to me, but yeah. So the wife is expected to stay at home and teach the kids and.
Right. Gothard's teachings were that if a woman worked outside the home, then her loyalty would be to her boss and she would not submit to her husband. And if she had financial means, then she would be in competition with her husband and therefore their marriage couldn't be successful. So you had those type of things on the application. It was an automatic no if you watched more than a certain amount of hours of TV. There were, of course, if you drank, if you smoked, there was just a really long and very extensive application process. And it was a big deal if you got accepted. So my parents considered it a huge honor to be accepted into the Advanced Training Institute.
Okay. And is the ATI still fully functioning today?
No, actually, their enrollment has continued to decline, especially in the wake of Recovering Grace coming out, the website, the blog that a lot of former students started back in the around 2011, 2013 in there. But actually just at the end of March, they posted that they were no longer accepting families for enrollment. They would just be selling their wisdom booklets to the public or, like at homeschool fairs and things like that. So that's been an interesting, very recent development.
Yeah, that's very interesting to me on a couple fronts. And one of the things that we talk about, we say that it really does take an army of survivors to come together, and survivors have a whole lot more power than probably they know they do. And I think this is one of those examples because the whole Gothard machine was so influential in homeschool groups across the nation. Like I didn't realize that until Eric Skwarczynski told us about it, because we weren't homeschooled and we just weren't part of those homeschool circles. So I didn't know that this was almost like a religion in itself.
Very much so. Very much so. It had a particular belief system. They would say publicly that they didn't encourage ATI families to congregate in churches and to, have an ATI church. But inevitably, that is what happened because they did not fit in normal churches because their belief system was so far outside the norm that, like, for instance, the church I was raised in, we had people traveling 2 hours each way on a Sunday just to attend church with like-minded people.
Wow.
So you would make sure you had a church with godly music, so there was no drums, there was no syncopation, even like they would make sure to remove syncopation even from the rhythms of the music. You would have, everyone was homeschooled, so you didn't have to worry about your children being corrupted by friends that were raised in public school. You didn't have to worry about dating because it was all forbidden. So people would come from a very, very far distance just to be a part of our church. Yeah. And that was very common in those circles. You would have churches that were Gothard churches, basically.
Yeah. Wow. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about Institute in Basic Life Principles, IBLP, and how you first met Bill Gothard and what, I think that'll set the framework kind of for your story and how that all unfolded.
Right. Well, IBLP, or the Institute in Basic Life Principles, is kind of the parent company for ATI. It was what Gothard started back in the late 50s, early 60s as campus teams, and then it was the Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts, and then it finally changed its name to Institute in Basic Life Principles. They had the basic seminar that Gothard, he used to pack out arenas. I mean, you would have 15 to 20,000 people pack out arenas around the country, and it was fairly exclusive even then. You would pay a significant fee for the time to come in, and you couldn't buy his books outside of those arenas. And he would give very strict instructions that you were not to share his teachings with people who had not attended the seminar, because he needed to explain the teachings. Of course, now that knowing that, it sends up huge red flags.
Yeah.
But at the time, it just made you feel special. And so IBLP is what birthed the ATI program in the mid 80s. And then from ATI came various opportunities for training programs. So at the time, they don't like the word teenager. They wanted young men and young women. And so instead of having kids in high school, you had apprenticeship students. So he taught, he was very against higher education. Your children should not go to college. Your children should not be educated past high school. And so he would have these opportunities for you to go and apprentice. That was the basic idea. And you would have opportunities for the students to come in. And so I had attended one of the opportunities. It was called Excel. It was in Dallas. It was an 8-week program where young women 16 and up could come. And it sounded very hands-on. And I'm a very tactile person. I like working with my hands and creating things. And so I thought it was going to be a lot of very hands-on activities and things like that. Some people referred to it as wife school. It wasn't exactly that, but it did have a lot of class time in addition to sewing lessons. And I don't know, we would do coloring analysis on our skin tones and things like that. It was interesting. I have fond memories of it. Not all of the memories were great, but I made some really good friends there. And I was invited back at the end of that. I was invited to come back and teach some of the sewing classes because that had been something I had honed those skills at home. And I did that. And then I was asked to come back as a team leader. They would have certain girls they picked out to come in and lead a team of about 8 girls to go through the program again. And I really wanted to do that. And so the prerequisite for that was that I attend a counseling seminar. And he would have usually it was about 4 or 5 days. He would have, they would separate the boys and the girls. And you would have hundreds of girls would come to Indianapolis to the training center they had downtown. And we would be taught by Gothard how to counsel. And he said that his counseling was better than a college degree and that we would be, equipped to teach other teenagers and other, people are, older than us. We would have more wisdom than our elders. So I went there, and at the time I was always very eager to sit at the front and to hear what was going on. I don't do that anymore.
I'm sure.
I mean, I actually just came to that realization the other day. I was thinking about that. I was like, that's why I don't sit at the front anymore.
Yeah.
But I was sitting, maybe 8 rows back. And at the end of one of the sessions, he locked eyes with me, and he just motioned for me to come forward to him. And so I did. And I remember my sister and I were there together, and we're just like, oh my gosh, Gothard wants to talk to us. Like it was a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
Gothard was, my parents referred to him as a modern day Apostle Paul. So this was like the equivalent of the Pope calling you to the front, and it was a huge honor. And I went down there. He said, he commented on my smile and how bright my eyes were. That was a big thing in the ATI program, was if someone was rebellious, their eyes would be dark. And if they were godly, their eyes would be bright. And so he commented on how bright my eyes were and how I have a beautiful smile, just lots of flattery. And he wanted me to come to Chicago to work with him at his headquarters, which was like the epitome of all honors, because it was invitation only usually.
Yeah.
And that had been my parents' goal for me for many years, as they said they wanted to be able to give back. And their goal was for me to be able to serve Gothard in Chicago at his headquarters. And so he's like, I really want you to come. Can you leave tonight? And I was like, what?
Wow.
I mean, it just totally threw me off. I was 16 years old, and he was like, well, let's go. I was like, well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, like my parents, I'd have to get my parents' permission. And he said, well, let's go call him. And this was pretty late at night. It was about 10 o'clock. He said, come on down to my office. And so I went down there to his office, and my sister was with me. He said, let's call your parents. And I was like, well, if you ask my parents anything at 11 o'clock at night, the answer is no.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's just not going to happen. And he's like, okay, well, we'll call tomorrow. So be down here tomorrow. And he gave me a time. And we called my parents the next day, and they thought that I should finish school first. And I had already committed to being in Dallas for the next Excel program to teach or to be a team leader. And so that put me at about a year out. But we agreed that I would go the next year and work for him in Chicago. And so I ended up traveling home from Indianapolis and just continued with the plan. I graduated from high school, was in Dallas for another 8 weeks. And then that next January, I traveled to Chicago to work for him there.
Wow. It's amazing to me, just taking a step back. And I know for you, hindsight, of course, gives you a lot of insight, but just the amount of control that he had at every single corner. I mean, from the not selling his books outside of the seminars, like everything was controlled to the T. I mean, to the T. Even the thing about the eyes, like you said that, and that struck me. Like, first of all, it's a bizarre statement to make, but when that's kind of your thing, like to know that he used that to rope you in, and not just you, no doubt he did that to so many others. It's just incredible when you think about everything that an abuser does. It has purpose. And that's what I try to explain to people. Like, hearing letters that my dad writes me from prison, he goes into, such detail about what he thinks somebody else is thinking when he says, how they respond, what he thinks they're thinking. And then if they respond this way, he'll have like canned responses, kind of an arsenal of responses, and he'll use the one that he thinks will be most effective for that particular person, and on and on and on. Like even breathing patterns. He talks about breathing patterns.
Oh, wow.
Like everything is intentional with abusers, everything. And the amount of focus that takes, and the amount of effort that takes.
I'm thinking
is
focus
unmistakable.
and patience. He was willing to wait that year, very willing. I assume he didn't get upset with you.
No, he didn't get upset, but I did see him a few times between that event and when I went up to Chicago, in Dallas, because he would come in and talk to the girls. And of course I was there, and he would greet me by name and ask me when I was coming to work for him.
I was just going to ask you that. Out of hundreds and hundreds, potentially thousands, he knew you by name. How special that must have made you feel, and probably sickens you now, but
now it does. Yes.
Yes. How special it must have made you feel, and your parents, that you were like the chosen one. When you think about it, it's like, wow, I see what happens, and it's horrible. It just really is, isn't it? It's just
I mean,
but I mean, I had been trained that was what we wanted.
Right.
Like to be noticed and invited was like the goal. So in some ways I felt like I was fulfilling what my parents had always wanted for me. And so I felt very good about that. And it did make you feel good to be noticed.
Absolutely.
And really, I mean, by default, fulfilling what God wanted for you, because you're trained to think that too. Like, you're obedient to your parents. Your parents are obedient to this man. He's a leader. He has position. He has knowledge. At least he positioned himself that way. He has the most amount of knowledge, the most amount of experience. And so, you can't help but to think when you're in that situation, like, if I do this, this must be what God wants for my life.
Oh, sure.
Which really messes with the head of a victim.
Sure it does.
Once that person abuses them, because then you're like, well, wait a second, if this is what God wanted for my life, why is this happening?
Did you?
Well, it just makes you double second guess everything that happens. You're like, wait a minute, if I'm doing what God wants, then this shouldn't make me feel uncomfortable, or this shouldn't make me feel weird. I'm just, there's something wrong with me.
Yeah, for sure.
Did you ever have a period of rebellion? Just curious, in your young adult / teen years?
No, I did not.
Did not.
Yeah. In many ways, I was what was considered a golden child.
Yes.
My parents' method of parenting, of their way of control, was through fear. If I listened to rock music, if I dated, all of those things, then God would strike me dead. I would be out from under the umbrella of protection. Wow. Or if I did those things and they found out, then they would kick me out of the home and pray for God to kill me, so I couldn't dishonor him. So it kept me, I was very scared for a very long time. And that was a common thing. It wasn't just me that heard that. And then I had a sister that they kicked out, and they actually did pray for her death. Like, it was something that they actually followed through with.
Well, it's the age-old question that people hate, which drives me insane. When people ask victims of abuse, well, why didn't you tell anybody? That's why you don't tell people.
Yeah, exactly.
You're terrified.
Well, and it wasn't so much that it was even we didn't tell anyone. It's what all my friends were told too.
Yeah.
When you're homeschooled and you're in a church where you're only, and I'm not against homeschooling. I have plenty of friends that homeschool and do a really good job. I don't believe in the whole all homeschoolers are not socialized. Sure. But I was one of the ones that wasn't socialized. And we were homeschooled in a very tight, enclosed environment, not really allowed to have friends outside of that environment. We went to a Gothard church where everyone was homeschooled and believed the way we did. Right. So, it wasn't even really a topic of conversation. Well, I'm going to listen to rock music, so my parents are going to kick me out and, pray for my death. No, everybody was threatened with that. And so it was normal for us.
To me, it really does.
Yeah,
it does. But when you're in the middle of a whole life like that, it's hard. It's impossible to see it. I think.
You can't see it.
No,
you really can't, because it's so ingrained in every aspect of your life that it is normalized.
Right.
Yeah. The further I get away from it, the more bizarre it becomes to me, and the more horrified I become. I don't become more like just mellow to this was my life. every year as I grow, I become more horrified at the things that we were taught were normal.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, tell us a little bit about once you made the move, you were 17 years old. You're now working directly under Gothard. How did the abuse begin, and when did you find out that there were more victims?
Okay, so when I got there, this is in hindsight, this is one of the bigger things now. I realized that he just wanted me to come work. He didn't have a job in mind for me. I told him what my training had been in. I had worked as a bookkeeper in my father's business for many years. So I kind of told him, like, this is my skill set. I can come and do these things. And he's like, sure, we'll put you there. And when I got there, they were like, who are you? Where are you working? Like, they didn't have any clue.
Wow.
Yeah. I was very fortunate at the time. Someone I knew and trusted was in the HR department. It was a very short-lived department at headquarters. It lasted for less than a year. But he was in that position, and he warned me when I got there. He said, be careful, Charis. He said, because he said, you're pretty and you're slightly flirtatious. He said, and Gothard will take note of you. And by slightly flirtatious, that just meant that I smiled at people. I've never been someone to be flirty. I've been asked out probably less than 5 times in my life, and most of those have happened since I've been married. I mean, I like to make sure my husband's aware of those. But it was not something that I really had to deal with on a regular basis. But that this person came to me and said, "You need to be careful. Gothard likes girls like you." And he will shower you with attention, and then he'll lose interest, and it will hurt you. And you just need to be aware that you're not as special as he makes you feel. And I was just like, well, whatever, no big deal. And I went into work in the ATI department. I was working for Telos, which is at the time, it was their distance-based learning college where you get a degree in the basic seminar, which is just laughable. But but the way it was set up is we had to be at staff meeting at 7:30 in the morning. We started work at 8. We had lunch all together in the staff center, which was underneath Gothard's office, about a quarter mile away. And then we would work till 5, and then we'd be off. And on the weekends, headquarters was different than the different training centers. We lived in different places. We weren't all in one building. I lived in an apartment with about 5 or 6 other girls about a half a mile from where we worked, and we would walk back and forth. And then on Saturdays, they would have, they didn't really have anything on Saturdays, but on Sundays, we would have a meeting. We would have like a Sunday school where Gothard taught Sunday school, and then you would go to church. They had buses to different churches. And then you had a Sunday night meeting where you ate dinner together. And Sunday was the only days the meetings weren't mandatory. Every other day they were mandatory, but on Sundays it was optional. So my parents told me when I left, they said, you'll never again in your life have opportunity to sit under such a godly man for concentrated learning. So it's our requirement that you must go to the Sunday meetings, both of them. And so I did. And a lot of times on Sundays, it was just a lot more casual. But even during the week, if Gothard saw me come in, he's like, Charis, come and sit with me. And he'd want me to sit at the head table with him. And I would sit across from him. And the first time I sat across from him, I was very nervous because I had set myself at the head table. And you know what Proverbs says about going to the head table, but I had been invited. And so I felt like I was as good of a place as I could be.
You're a guest of honor.
I'm a guest of honor.
Uh-huh.
And it was flattering, but I felt so embarrassed because my feet kept accidentally bumping into Gothard's. And it just made me feel so terrible. I must have been the most rude person. And then it happened again the next day. And then it happened again the next day. And then it wasn't just bumping into my feet. His feet would start rubbing my feet with his feet under the table. It came to where if I sat down, I would have to wrap my feet around the legs of my chair to keep them, because otherwise he would seek out my feet and start rubbing my feet with his feet. And this would be at the head table in front of all the staff, but it was under the table, so you couldn't really see it. It just made me feel very, very awkward. Mostly that I felt like I was just, good grief, Charis, can you not control your feet at first? And then realizing he was doing it. And then I didn't know what to believe about that. I didn't know how it made me feel. And then especially on Sunday afternoons, after the meeting, he would say, Charis, why don't you come out to my office and we'll talk? And I would go up there and he would question me about relationships with friends, particularly boys, wanting to know if I had a boyfriend, what we had done together physically, like how far we had gone. I had never had a boyfriend. I didn't have anything to confess, but that didn't stop him from asking over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And he would want me to sit next to him on his couch. And so he would put his hand on my knee, and then he would end up like rubbing it back and forth. And just, he would sit, you have the whole couch, and he would sit so close that your entire like hip and thigh and legs are all touching, and just, it was just icky.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to do about it. And that continued, for a couple of weeks. And I called my parents, because sometimes he'd invite me to go to church with him. And then at church, he would just lay his head on my shoulder and fall asleep during the service. And that made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't know what to do. Like, I was just like, I'm just like, I feel so weird. And so I called my parents and I said, look, I just feel very uncomfortable with the way he's touching me. He's touching my feet all the time, and he's touching my legs, and he's laying on top, he's leaning over and falling asleep on me. And that just is very uncomfortable. And my parents said, look, Charis, that's not a big deal. Like, he would never do anything inappropriate. You must be too friendly. And so I remember my dad very specifically telling me that I needed, if I wanted to, I could be less friendly. If I felt uncomfortable, I could be less friendly. They would give me permission to be less friendly. And so I perhaps could not feel uncomfortable. So I did. I would purposely go late to meetings. I would purposely sit in the back. And it never stopped Gothard's attention. If I came in, if I could duck behind someone taller than me, he wouldn't notice me until the head table was already full. And so I could sit in the back somewhere. I would sit in the back during Sunday school and things like that. So he couldn't invite me to, to sit up front, or I would make plans so I couldn't go to lunch with him after church, things like that. But it didn't stop him. Occasionally I couldn't get out of it, and I would still be roped into coming up to his office and sitting with him. And he would, with his clothing still on, expose himself to me. And I thought he was just rude. I thought he was so rude.
Yeah.
But again, my parents would assure me every time I talked to them that he would never do anything wrong. I was just too sensitive, and it wasn't a big deal. And so not to worry about it.
I think that's so hard, because it's like the adults too. This is what people need to understand. Like, adults are taught by abusers. Like, all the twisted theology we have on forgiveness and on, like, just forgive and move on, requires absolutely nothing of the abuser.
Right.
Or in that case, they don't even use the term abuse. It's being friendly, things like that. But that's being taught by the abusers. And I wish people understood, like, I wish I could really make people understand how much of our current theology that we have, that we believe, and with Bible verses, that we believe hook, line, and sinker, that it is fact that the Bible says these things, has been made up by abusers. It's been twisted slightly. There's enough truth in it, that it sounds right, but it's been twisted. And it sounds to me, from where I'm sitting, like your parents were victim to that kind of teaching too, where that kind of stuff is minimized through the teachings of Gothard. That when a man, when a man is fully clothed, there's nothing going on, unless, it's the woman who's arousing the man, and then, it's her fault and she's being too friendly. And, like, this whole thing is so twisted.
Well, here again, when we put somebody up on that pedestal, as he was, you referenced him, that he was like the Pope, getting that response, your eyes are lovely, or they're light and bright, whatever, your smile is godly, whatever. We have these people up where in our minds they can do no wrong, because they are people of God. So
That's right.
whatever they say, whatever they do in our minds is right. And it must be us who is doing the wrong thinking, the wrong acting, the sitting too close, the accidental touching, flirtatious touch with our foot. And we put the burden on ourselves rather than, see that people are not perfect. And until we stop believing that too, we're going to have people who can take total control of our minds. And that's exactly what he did through his teachings, through his behavior, through his closed doors, through his meetings, through his school, the whole thing. He had total control, total control. And
it's true. And I do believe my parents were trained and groomed by Gothard. The wisdom booklets that he has through ATI were always teaching that it was the woman at fault. The counseling seminar, they have a whole sheet that was handed out to us on how to counsel victims of sexual abuse. And it was all about them acknowledging their sin and tempting the perpetrator. And I as a parent now, I look back at that and I'm like, if my child told me they were uncomfortable and they were not feeling at ease with someone touching them physically, the mama bear comes out and I'm going to go get them and take care of them. It doesn't matter who the person is. But that was just not the case. They had been conditioned to believe he was the godliest of men. And so it didn't matter how uncomfortable I felt, because they had also been taught that all teenagers were rebellious. So even if I was doing everything they wanted, it had to have been me that was at fault. And, of course, now looking back, it's a lot bigger deal to me. At the time, I was just like, man, I cannot believe I'm so sensitive. I'm so I'm not, something is wrong with me. I didn't think I had done anything wrong, but for me feeling so uncomfortable, it must be something wrong with me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we come from a conservative background too, probably not nearly as conservative, but independent churches, Churches of Christ,
right.
They're independent. We don't have any governing board or body. Research shows over and over again that in these extremely conservative churches, extremely conservative religious cultures, abuse is really disproportionately dominant in those churches. So how much do you think these kinds of teachings contribute to that, to the control and the abuse, and just lending itself to abusive leaders, like the teachings of women and children being submissive, that, if you've been a victim of rape, then you must have done something to arouse this man, because men can't control their urges, right? It's those kinds of teachings. How much do you think that contributes?
It contributes a whole lot. It's hard when you're in it to understand it. And that's why it's so important. I think that's why I want to keep going back and examining what I was raised in, because I need to be able to look back and say, okay, this was wrong. As I look back at the church I grew up in, as I began to understand abuse, it was a long time. It's embarrassingly how old I was, or how long it took me to discover that I had been abused. But when I look back at what I had been raised in, I recognized so many of the women that I was told were not submissive women. He wouldn't be so mean if she were submissive. If he hadn't married a rebellious woman, he wouldn't be so unkind. And now I look back and I see all these women that were horrifically abused, physically, financially, socially, emotionally, mentally. All of this abuse was just prevalent in our church. And it was all, as different things came out over the years, the church fractured, and there's been a lot of people that have that don't speak to their parents anymore. The husbands and wives have finally gotten a divorce. It's been very revealing to me just to watch the disintegration of that group of people. And it's been very sad, but also very few of them have actually dealt with anything. They've just decided it's in the past. We don't need to deal with it. And I don't think that's not how we heal.
Right.
We have to acknowledge, and then replace it with truth, and then move on.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because I think if you don't deal with it, if you don't get it out in the open, if you don't do what you're doing and keep going back, keep looking back and processing that and saying, holy cow, like this really was not a healthy teaching. If you don't do that, if you don't examine those teachings and figure it out and process it, then you kind of continue that process unknowingly. But, in my opinion, that process it carries on for generations, because you still don't have a healthy teaching about boundaries and about sex and about, authority and whatever, you name it. You just don't have a healthy view, because that's not something you can just sweep under the rug and be like, okay, that's in the past. And
no, you can't. And when a lot of this stuff came out, I didn't hear from people in my church that I grew up in. Of course, I had left the church by that point, but I was still talking to. I mean, it wasn't like it ruined relationships. So I just wasn't in consistent fellowship with them. But 2 of them reached out. One of them had finally left her abusive husband, and she told me how proud she was of me, and that was very meaningful. And one of them reached out to make sure I wasn't bitter.
Aye.
And that was very that was heartbreaking to me, because she had also heard me telling someone about my experience with Gothard before I even realized it was abuse. And she warned me that I was speaking against a man of God. And I told her at the time, I did not understand that it was abuse at the time, but I told her right then and there, I was like, I don't believe he's a believer. Wow. I just don't. Yeah. I lived with him. He did not have the fruits of the Spirit. Wow. And I knew that there was something besides just what I experienced. Like I came to a point when I was in Chicago that I knew they were lying. I knew they were breaking the law, and I had to leave. And it had nothing to do with the way Gothard touched me, because I didn't know that was abuse. But I knew what he was doing with payroll was against payroll law, because I had been trained in payroll law. I knew that what he was asking us to do and the stories he was printing in his newsletters were false, because I had been there and I knew those things had not happened the way he said. So when I came home, and that was what I was met with, was being told I was speaking against a man of God. And then years later, as more abuse stories came out, that same person reached out to me just to make sure I wasn't bitter. No acknowledgement that they had actually helped perpetuate the abuse, that they were leaders in the church, and that they had helped distribute and teach his teachings, but just to make sure I wasn't bitter, because in Gothard's world, bitterness was the height of sin. Like, it was really, that was treated as the worst of the worst sins. Well,
of course, that's how you cover it up.
Exactly.
Keep people who feel something inside of them, something's not right, and we need to talk about this. Make them believe that they're bitter, and that bitterness will send you, that's like a straight ticket to hell.
Oh yeah.
It's so hard, Charis. I'm sure you feel this way, to look at a person who professes to be this godly person in front of thousands, but when you know the immorality, the wrong actions that are done against people, honest, good, believing people who got really just brought into this culture. It's a culture that people were sucked into, and they're being just stabbed over and over and over again, but they can't see it because they have been told so many times, this is such a godly man, he would never. Definitely. And if you're like me, it's really painful to look back. It has to be done, but it's so painful to see that, and to know that there really aren't that many around who get it or who care. Right. You grew up with these people in the church. You were bonded, at the heart with them, and really they're checking to see if you were not bitter. That hurts. Just, and I think there are many of us who have been, at the foot of that, of feeling that hurt. But then when you pull back and you really look at this situation, you understand their eyes just aren't clear. They're not clear, neither are their hearts. And I have to keep telling myself that a heart that is not a heart of God will never see the truth, will never, ever see the truth.
And I acknowledge it's got to be difficult because so many of these people had been following the teachings of Gothard for 40 years or more. And then when they find out that, wait a minute, he didn't have good intentions, he was actually abusing people, that's humiliating. And I can empathize that has to be a very difficult thing to do. But one of the things, I mean, I've had so many different therapists over the last 10 or 12 years, and each one had a role and each one had a season. And sometimes I just needed someone to say, no, that's not normal. That's not normal. You're not crazy for feeling that way. That's not normal. And then some we've gotten into the theology behind it. But what I have found that was so very helpful for my husband and I was to learn the truth. Because if you know the truth, you can identify the lie. Absolutely. But you have to be willing to pull it apart and to look at what you had been taught and what you had believed and being able to say, I mean, I can take apart that umbrella diagram. There's scripture to back it up. It is so false. It is so full of lies that I can completely refute that. But I had to be willing to do that hard work and to dive into it. And it was very painful. But I'm not interested in living a life that's not truthful now. I couldn't go back.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Couldn't.
Good. I'm glad.
But I mean, I have children of my own now. I mean, I have older teenagers, and being able to see them be able to define truth and to be able to pick apart things that are not true. In skillful ways, it makes me feel like that journey, that hard work has been worth it. Because I mean, when we first started parenting, we didn't believe all of Gothard's stuff was true, but we still didn't have a whole lot of framework to work with that was outside of that. And it took my husband and I quite a few years to kind of change our parenting techniques and move away from some of the fear-based tactics. And we've apologized to our older children for some of the fear that we instilled in them, but then also been careful to replace it with truth. And they've grown up to be quite skillful at discerning what is true.
Yeah, I think that's really healthy.
Yes.
Very healthy. Well, tell us a little bit about this lawsuit. There was kind of a collective group that came together and filed a lawsuit. Was it against Bill Gothard himself?
Yes and no. We filed it with 5 of us, got together and decided to sue. And our attorney, basically, IBLP is the one that had the finances and that ultimately was responsible. They were the board of directors. Gothard did not had famously would say that he didn't really collect anything more than a very meager salary. So we felt like in order to stop him, we went for IBLP. We did later amend that to include Gothard and name him, as well as some of the other abusers that had been in the different training centers. But as that case evolved, we changed attorneys, through a lot of drama there. We would add people, some people would drop out, but it eventually ended up being about 18 of us that took it pretty much to the end. And then it was very emotionally taxing. You would have to fill out pages upon pages of interrogatories and answering questions, and then you'd have to give them all the contact information for your family and friends, and then they would call them and they would just grill them. My siblings were interviewed, my parents were interviewed, and it was very tricky because my parents had acknowledged that what Gothard had done to me for many years, until I came to the realization it was abuse, and I called it abuse, and then they had never heard of it. They made pre-public announcements that they had never known that Gothard had touched anyone. And so it was a very scary season because I had to face the very real possibility that they would deny ever having known about it to an attorney, or if they were ever called to testify, that might be a possibility. It was very intrusive. We had to turn over our entire Facebook accounts so they could read all of our private messages and all of our chats. And we had unwisely, we found each other online. So a lot of us didn't know we were abused until we started talking with other people. And we're like, I thought I was the only one he had ever touched. And then you come into a group and someone says something, oh, when he touched me, and you're like, say that again. And then it would start the conversation. Then you have all these girls chiming in, well, he did that to me, and he did that to me, and oh, my sister had him do that to her. And you start having all these women come together. And so we found each other online, and we built a community that way. And it was through that we started to realize the abuse, the depth of abuse, how widespread it was, and honestly, how widely acknowledged it was. I mean, it was known that we were Gothard's girls. And when we've gotten together, you put us in a line, we all look like sisters. Despite popular opinion, we were not all blonde haired and blue eyed. There's quite a few brunettes. But he did have a type. Like, generally they had people that were easy to smile and were friendly.
Yeah.
But we all had very similar experiences. And as we walked through that process, and then it got more and more intrusive, and we looked at what the cost would be emotionally and financially. And then a couple of people felt so unsafe that they had to back out. And without the collective, we didn't feel our lawsuit was as strong. And so we felt like, in interest of everyone's mental and emotional well-being, we needed to dismiss. And so we did. And then Gothard sued us. He sued 7 of us for defamation and for filing a frivolous lawsuit. And then we had to hire another attorney, a specialized attorney, to appeal that. And that was when we had to go to Chicago and testify in court that we were being honest about what had happened.
Yeah, I think that's the thing people need to realize, like, abusers and abusive institutions especially will throw everything at survivors to shut them up. And typically, those counter lawsuits are not that uncommon, unfortunately. And they know in a defamation lawsuit, what a lot of people might not realize. I know you know it well because you went through it, but the burden of proof is on the person who files that lawsuit, not on you. They
Correct.
have to prove that you intentionally lied, you intentionally made up details, and that you had the intent to harm. And that's a really high threshold. It's almost impossible to win a lawsuit like that.
Correct.
And they know it. Gothard knew that when he filed. His attorneys knew that. But they try to put this big financial strain on survivors to silence them. Because obviously at that point, telling you that you're bitter isn't going to work anymore. Like, no, you kind of passed that exit,
we had
left it in the rear view mirror.
It can cause a lot of, it was very, it was very scary season.
Sure.
I remember just laying on the floor in my bedroom and sobbing because I was so scared of what could happen. Because if by some chance he won this frivolous thing he had thrown at us, then we would be in we would have it on our record. I'm a real estate agent. There's a chance I would lose my license. I had finally gotten the courage to get a job outside the home, and I loved my job. And here I was faced with something that could take it away.
Yeah.
And that was devastating. But it was that collective that we found, the group of survivors, finding that tribe of women and men that surrounded us and lifted us up in prayer. I have never felt God's presence more than I felt that day in court. It was
incredible.
Yes.
It was incredible.
It is.
To know that I was surrounded by so many people that were praying for us, and knowing that they were lifting us up before the throne, and that we had the truth on our side.
Yes.
And that was what our attorney kept saying, look, tell the truth. That's all you have to do is tell the truth. And, Gothard, we tried mediation for a long time before we got there, but Gothard wanted us to issue a statement saying that we had made it all up. and we would not do it.
Good.
Yeah.
Yes.
He would drop the lawsuit. He would not sue us. He would go away if we would just say we had made it up, and we all refused.
Yeah. Good.
Yes. You have so much courage. It takes so much courage and strength to do what you did and to stay firm, and thank God for those who surrounded all of you and held you up during that season.
And
thank
that's
God for them.
That's what people
Yes.
need to get.
Yes.
The importance of
Yes.
just showing up. They
Yes.
don't, I doubt these people had to do a whole lot other than show up, but it's that showing up in support of you, not him.
Yes.
Right.
That's so important for survivors everywhere. They really, you guys need that support. You have to have that support.
And there's quite a few of us that are really, really close now. I have my best friend is one of the other plaintiffs. I mean, we've become so close and check up on each other. Like if I'm struggling with something now, it doesn't have anything to do with Gothard or anything. I can let them know, and they're going to pray for me because they know that, because there's just so much that comes, emotional baggage that you one little domino can lead to a whole lot of other emotional dominoes that really probably don't have anything to do with the situation, but can affect you in negative ways. And to know that I have people that have been there and understand. But it's also given me, at least a couple of times a month, I have a couple people reach out and say, I have a friend that's going through this. Can you talk to them? Or, Charis, I read your story and I'm experiencing this. Can we talk? And those have been some really special times. Yeah.
Well, and here's what I want to emphasize to people, because so many survivors do feel so alone. And you guys had that collective. It wasn't a huge collective either. It wasn't like, this was thousands of people coming together. It was a handful of people. You guys had incredible courage, and you refused to speak anything but the truth. And I think that was really important. And so if people don't know how much power survivors have, somebody like Gothard this is my term, he was resired in 2014. So he was technically, he was removed from his post by the board. He was likely gonna be fired. And so he did damage control. It's what they all do. He resigned, and I'm sure spun a pretty good web. I'm not familiar with what his side of it was, but usually they spin a pretty good web about, it's just the time, it's the season to get out of ministry. And, it's like this graceful exit. And so, they kind of quietly go into retirement. And you guys did that. You guys helped bring the truth to light, to the point where somebody as powerful as him, and that guy had so much power, was forced out of his position. Now he's still, of course, he's still going to be out there. He's still going to be influencing people, but his influence was dramatically decreased. It was diminished because there was a small group of survivors that stood up. And you guys refused to tell a lie.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people, Gothard supporters, we got a lot of pushback because we had, when you're filing a lawsuit like we did, it automatically, unless you name something over $50,000, it automatically goes into small claims court. And so our attorneys just put for each count 50,000 plus, or whatever. I don't remember the exact legal verbiage. So a lot of people accused us of just wanting money. Yeah. And that was never the case for us. Now, of course, like I have pay a lot of money in therapist bills every month, and I do that because it's important for my healing. But that was not why we filed the lawsuit, and we got a lot of pushback on that. People, his supporters just said, "Oh, you're just money hungry," and that was really frustrating for us because it was so false. So Gothard resigning and then us dismissing the lawsuit, we still consider it a win, because what we wanted was for him not to have access to other girls.
Yes.
We did not want him to have influence on other teenagers or children. We can't control what people, he will always have a handful of followers. He will, because people just cannot come to grips with the fact that he is a false teacher.
Yeah.
But as far as that goes, we consider it a win because he is no longer in a position of power.
Right.
Now, the news we got recently about ATI shutting down was also very validating. The numbers have been slowly, shrinking for very many years, but knowing that that now the public will have access to that, and once you have the public seeing his teachings, wow, I can't wait to see some of those book reviews.
Yeah, I know. It was unreal when Eric read excerpts from the wisdom booklet.
Yeah.
I mean, and he read like for 2 minutes, and I was like, it made my head spin.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is insanity.
Yeah.
Like this makes insanity look sane. Like it was nuts.
Bad. Yeah.
Like about beating kids and, like the size of the sticks that you're allowed to use when you beat your kids. Like it was very detailed, very graphic. And I was like, man, this is, it's not going to bode well in the public eye when that's released.
No, and a couple months ago, of course, with all the stuff coming out with Josh Duggar and the lawsuit and all of that, IBLP was contacted, I believe it was by NBC News, to put out a statement. And they did. They've usually been pretty quiet and tight-lipped about it, but they did put out a statement. And the gist of it was that we've never taught abuse. We've never put up with abuse and all this stuff. And it was a very, I remember reading it late one night, and one of the other plaintiffs and I, we were texting back and forth as we read through it. And it just made us so angry because we're like, this is so easy to refute because it's so false. Like we have it in black and white where they printed it. And there's so much that he didn't print. Like a lot of stuff he would just say in conferences. And so we have it like in notes from all these people that remember it happening, but he didn't actually print it. But a lot of the things they said in their statement were actually in black and white, and we had copies of it. So a couple of us got together and we wrote an article where we really didn't have to say a whole lot. We're like, you say this, here's where you taught this. And we put up the one about how to counsel sexual abuse, where they told a 4-year-old, what did a 4-year-old done to cause the abuse? About boys that had abused their sisters and how it's because their sisters had taken a bath and not been fully dressed. It was all these different things. I mean, it was very clear in their teachings. And so our article, I don't know, it didn't go viral or anything like that, but it was so easy to refute what they said, and we let it be in their own words. We did not have to say a whole lot. We're just like, you say this, here's where you taught this. This is what you said. Here's where you actually taught the opposite. And it was kind of cathartic to write that.
Yeah, I read it. Yeah. You had sent me the link, and I'll link to that too in this podcast in the description. But I thought it was really powerful. It was really well done, and like you said, you guys didn't have to elaborate. You just it was like black and white.
Right. Yeah.
Here's your statement.
It's
here's
weird.
What's written.
It still takes people a while to get it, doesn't it? Even when you can see in black and white. It still takes people a while to get it, but eventually they do. They do eventually. That light is shining, the truth is coming out, and you can't stop it. Once it starts, you cannot stop it.
Yeah.
So
that's right. And we're just very concerned with the truth is pretty simple.
Yeah.
And so that has been our focus all along, and it continues to be what we push for. So
absolutely.
We're really excited about.
Yeah. Well, thank you for speaking your truth and for sharing your story with us today. And I hope this is helpful for people. I know it will. I say that. I know it will be helpful.
Are you kidding? This is going to be very helpful.
Because there are people who are trapped, and they may not be in the same religious circles, but they're trapped in these systems, and they feel like it's their fault, like something's wrong with them. And I hope that this really gives them insight that, this is not on you. Like people design these whole systems for abuse. I mean, they're from the very inception, they're designed to abuse people.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking about that I say a lot when people contact me is one of the things that I was taught is when I felt like something was off, in that situation with Gothard, one of the things I was reminded of is, the heart is deceitful and wicked. And so if we feel it that way, it's just, something's wrong with us. It's guilt. It's not really something wrong with that. It's just there's something wrong with you. But what I have come to understand, and it's taking a lot of me being very intentional, God gave us those feelings. When we feel something is off, a lot of times we refer to it as our gut, something just felt off in our gut. My gut feelings are very, very accurate.
Yep.
I cannot tell you how many times I've met someone and been like, something is off, and I'm going to keep my distance, and then come find out later there was definite reason that I should have done that, and learning to trust my gut and to go with that from that God-given. I think it's the Holy Spirit.
I do too.
Like that gives us wisdom.
Exactly. Yes.
But I was taught that it was just something wrong with me if it was someone in authority and someone who is godly. And I now know that that's just not true. And so I know that when I talk to other survivors coming out of other, especially religious circles, that tends to be where they hone in on and say, well, it's just because you're wicked. You're feeling this way. And no, that is a God-given feeling. It is protection. It is the Holy Spirit telling you something is off.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I'll link to a couple of resources too for our listeners. But one is the book, The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. Phenomenal book that talks about intuition. It is this God-given gift that our intuition, our gut feelings, they're there to keep us alive. They're there. It's this instinct that's inside of us, and we need to listen to it. And that's, Gavin de Becker talks about how to really tap into that intuition, to remove yourself from those lethal, dangerous situations. The other one is Wade Mullen's book, Something's Not Right. It is excellent. And he did his doctoral dissertation on church abuse. And it is so good. And we interviewed Wade when his book came out, but it's just so good at unpacking all that stuff. When you feel like something's not right, something's not right.
Yeah, exactly.
And you really, 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 I think you're right. I think it's the Holy Spirit. I think that
I do too.
God gives us that gift so that we listen to that feel. It's a feeling, it's not it's not logic. No. It's a feeling that wells up inside of you, and
it gnaws
that's by
at
design.
Us. It doesn't stop.
It's not meant to be pleasant.
It's there to and it's there to guide us, I believe, or to shake us, wake us up. Say, "Whoa, step back. Something's not good here." And when we listen, when we act upon that, we later find out, "Hey, that was right. That was right." Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yes.
Yeah. So learning to listen to your gut, that's
it's
a whole
huge.
nother, it definitely a game changer.
Yes.
It does. It served me well when I have listened to it. So
yes.
I'm still growing in that area, but especially in the business I'm in, it's actually very important. So I'm glad I began learning those lessons quite a while back.
For sure. Well, Charis, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your story, pouring your heart out. I know that I learned a lot. I'm sure you did too.
I learned a lot. I'm encouraged. I'm strengthened. I just think the truth comes out in you. Just hearing you talk, you're poised, you're certain of what you know. And I think so many people need that right now.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Charis. Thank you.
Of course, anytime. Thank you very much for the invitation.
You're so welcome. And to our listeners, I'll link to all the resources that we mentioned. I'll link to those in the description. We thank you for tuning into this episode. Please share it. Get this episode out there and let people know. There are so many people who are trapped in very, very bad situations. Oftentimes they need to know that they're in a bad situation because they, like you, they didn't know. So get this out there, get this information out there, help us spread the word. We thank you, and we'll catch you next episode.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. A special thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. Please help us get the word out by searching for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. Please consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron and check out the rewards our patrons receive.